Longines time is now 1 minute to 8.
Good evening, ATV's News at 8 for Monday the 5th of June. Tonight, the Beijing crisis is continuing, with troops still reported to be attacking civilians in the streets. There's been worldwide condemnation of the military action.
Locally, the stock market lost 22% of its value today in reaction to the military crackdown in Beijing. And the situation has prompted the governor, Sir David Wilson, to postpone a visit to Britain.
Troops in Beijing have continued to fire indiscriminately at unarmed residents who are still defying the military crackdown on student demonstrators. The Chinese capital is reported to be in chaos as the violence continues. The death toll is estimated to be in the thousands, although Beijing City Radio's evening broadcast said that not one person was killed in the assault on Tiananmen Square. That report sharply contradicts eyewitness accounts of the violence. The government has officially admitted that some civilians died in the army crackdown and said more than 1,000 soldiers were killed or injured. Stuart Pallister has more details on the situation in Beijing.
Helicopters buzzed overhead around the city centre, with one landing in the middle of Tiananmen Square surrounded by troops. The Avenue of Eternal Peace has failed to live up to its name. Eyewitnesses in the Beijing hotel reported seeing at least 2 people fall under a hail of bullets fired at random as troops drove to Tiananmen Square. In the square, there were reportedly more than 65 tanks and armored personnel carriers sitting directly below the pole. One man even tried to halt a line of tanks single-handedly. He blocked a line of 10 tanks and 10 troop carriers moving west from Tiananmen early this afternoon and climbed on top of the lead vehicle. Troops began firing automatic weapons and a helicopter appeared overhead. Hundreds of people fled in panic, leaving the man to face the tanks alone. Finally, about half a dozen people rushed over and dragged the man to safety. Soldiers fired wildly as they passed through a foreign embassy area of Beijing. They charged into a residential area near Tiananmen Square at about noon, firing down narrow streets. Shooting has also been reported in the northwest of the city near the campus area. There's been no official confirmation about the number of casualties, but the Reuters news agency says there's an estimate, apparently based on official information, that up to 7,000 people may have died. Beijing television has denied what it called a rumor that 3,000 died in the attack on the square. And as the students were forced out, they were unable to control their tears. A group of students explained what happened when the troops moved in.
The soldiers beat the students with heavy sticks and police. Yeah,
with their guns.
And
so many students
fell down very, very roughly, very rude.
They shouted.
And many students were pushed down to the ground, and other students walked over their bodies. And I'm sure that many students died.
Protests have erupted in several major Chinese cities as tens of thousands of people vented their anger over the violence in Beijing. Daisy Mundup reports.
The army assault on pro-democracy students in Beijing provoked protests in some of China's biggest cities. In Shanghai, Nanjing, Wuhan and Hangzhou, protested students sat on railway tracks holding up traffic. A general strike is beginning to take hold in Shanghai and Nanjing. Transport in Shanghai has virtually ground to a halt as students in China's biggest city erected barricades on roads leading to universities. In many other cities, people wore black armbands to protest against the military crackdown in Beijing.
People arriving in Hong Kong from all parts of China today spoke of the anger of residents who are only just hearing the news of the violence. Sarah Yearn reports.
The travellers arriving at Kai Tak this morning were clearly pleased to be back, as they related stories of what they'd heard about the military crackdown on Saturday night. Most of them came from the Chinese cities of Shanghai, Nanking and Tianjin, and said all the information they had came through government reports and what they could glean from the BBC World Service. But they said the local residents were clearly outraged by what they'd heard, and many were taking to the streets in protest. One person who'd come from Shanghai said protesters there were sure such action would not be taken against them as well, as they believed the government's quarrel lay only with students occupying Tiananmen Square. One woman was near to tears as she came down the arrivals ramp. As a nurse, she'd spent time in Tiananmen Square helping students at the height of their hunger strike. But now she realized it had all been in vain.
Here I nurse the kids all back to health, and now they've gotten killed, and it's just really hard to...
On a happier note, the arrival of a Hong Kong student was a reassuring one, as he'd last been seen in Tiananmen Square at the height of the shooting. He told of how he'd seen people fall before him and others being loaded onto bike taxis in a bid to get them to hospitals before they died. He'd been luckier. He managed to run through the melee and get to the railway station where he caught a train to Tianjin. From there, he'd easily caught a flight home. But he said many other Hong Kong students had been in the square at the same time as him, and he didn't know what had happened to them. But he urged them to get out of the capital as quickly as they can.
OMELCO members have expressed shock over the Chinese government's violent suppression of student demonstrators in Beijing. Carolyn Libby reports.
Senior Executive Councillor Dame Lydia Dunn says the recent violence indicates how different our systems are, and says that many of us take our freedoms here for granted.
The events in China have highlighted how very different our two systems are. We in Hong Kong, no matter how angry we are, we must put all our energies into preserving our system, the separateness of our system. In particular, the freedom of expression and the freedom of the press.
She said it was understandable that Hong Kong people would want to channel their frustration in a positive way, and says she could see why people would want to strike this Wednesday. Meanwhile, Legislative Councillor Stephen Chong says the Hong Kong Support Alliance's proposal for a one-day strike on Wednesday wouldn't hurt Hong Kong. Legislative councillors representing the industrial and commercial sectors today said they sympathize with Hong Kong people's wish to express their anger over what's happened in China. They stressed the strike on Wednesday would be strictly voluntary.
There's been a sharp plunge in local share prices as the stock market reacted to the violence in Beijing. The Hang Seng Index lost 22%, or 581 points, to close at 2,093. Here's Carolyn Libby again.
In reaction to the uncertainty in China, the market nosedived 22% today, with property shares leading the fall. This was the largest drop since the October 1987 stock market crash, and the market is now only slightly above the level after the crash. Financial analysts say they think investors will stay away until the situation becomes clearer in China. They said despite the sharp falls of recent weeks, share prices may have to drop further in order to entice investors back into the market.
But if you do get a period of following this, a relatively low turnover for a few months, that would be not surprising. It's a fairly normal pattern.
But most agreed that although confidence has been jarred in the short term, investors will come back to the market.
If one is going to be very negative about Hong Kong, then the market could go quite a lot lower. But Hong Kong, time and again, has proved itself a very resilient place. And it's been, I've seen very many occasions where it's been right to buy Hong Kong in a crisis. The difficult question, in my mind, is not whether it's right to buy, but whether one should be buying now or next month or the month after. In other words, exactly the timing. I don't think it's right to panic.
Meanwhile, the Financial Secretary Piers Jacobs and Legislative Councillors Martin Lee and Sito Hua have called on people to stop their runs on the territory's 13 Chinese banks. Depositors queued up outside the banks to withdraw their money in protest against the Chinese government's violent suppression of demonstrators in Beijing.
No bank, no matter how strong, can withstand action of this kind, because the cash made available to provide for contingencies do not cover this sort of contingency, where people have a run on the bank. And therefore, it's going to spill. It will spill over to other banks, even the largest banks in Hong Kong. And it will ruin the entire economy of Hong Kong if this goes on.
Mr. Lee says a better way for people to show their opposition to the Chinese government's action will be to join the territory-wide strike on Wednesday. Mr. Jacobs agreed that people should protest in a way that won't have a negative effect on the local economy. He says due to the bank runs, the exchange fund had to inject $194 million into the interbank market today.
The British Parliamentary Foreign Affairs Committee says it is reconsidering its recommendations for a report on the future of Hong Kong in the light of the military crackdown in Beijing. Sarah Yearn reports.
The chairman of the Parliamentary Foreign Affairs Committee, which is 2 months into a report on the implementation of the Sino-British Joint Declaration, claims the Chinese government's handling of the 7-week-old student protest has thrown their recommendations into chaos. Conservative David Howell claims it will be impossible not to take serious note of the way the troops stormed into the capital, killing thousands in response to what was essentially a peaceful demonstration. However, the committee still intends to submit its final report on time this July. And Mr. Howell feels, however awful the situation in China, it may well mean their report is viewed much more favourably by Parliament than was originally expected.
It certainly has to be said that the horrors and atrocities in Beijing have vastly heightened British and Westminster awareness and interest in the whole issue of Hong Kong, and therefore I think our views will be followed very closely indeed at Westminster.
Meanwhile, the Governor, Sir David Wilson, has postponed his planned visit to London, where he was to hold talks with the 11-member committee this Wednesday. No official reason was given for the delay, but it's thought he wants more time to monitor events in China before giving his evidence. Mr. Howell says they fully understand the Governor's decision and are expecting both he and the Foreign Secretary to alter their previous opinions on the fate of Hong Kong and its 6 million citizens. Sir Geoffrey Howe said today work on the joint declaration has been put on ice for the time being. The British newspapers this morning carried editorials demanding the government suspend all further negotiations with Beijing on the Hong Kong handover and advising British investors to pull out of a country which can, as they put it, turn their guns on children.
Meanwhile, Sir Geoffrey has come under fire from a number of Conservative MPs, some of whom have called for diplomatic relations with China to be cut off. The Foreign Secretary has been heavily criticised for saying on television last night that it was too early to think about sanctions against Beijing. British MPs have also said that Britain should seek massive reassurances from China about Hong Kong's future.
The European Commission has cancelled ministerial talks with the Chinese government and expressed its dismay and shock at the bloodshed in Beijing. The talks were scheduled for today. The Commission says that cooperation between the European community and China can only suffer as a result of the violence. A statement issued by the Commission said it deplores the brutal repression of the people of Beijing. Hundreds of thousands of people in Taiwan have taken to the streets to protest against the actions of the mainland government. Sarah Yearn reports.
Residents of Taiwan's 3 biggest cities, Kaohsiung, Taichung and the capital Taipei, poured into the streets today, lamenting the action of the mainland government and renewing cries for the downfall of the government. This time it wasn't only Premier Li Peng's name on their lips. The hundreds of thousands of demonstrators also demanded the removal and criminal trial of the Central Military Commission leaders Deng Xiaoping and President Yang Shangkan, the man known to have ordered Saturday's massacre. Many wore black armbands in commiseration of the loss of their counterparts on the mainland, and there was little sign of the joviality common to last week's rallies. Meanwhile, the Taiwan stock market lost a record 455 points and the price index slid 5%. Stock market officials there said the massive selling spree was further prompted by the fear of possible repercussions from China directed at Taiwan, as the island is still technically at war with the mainland. President Lee Teng-hui has put the military on alert, and Taiwan is believed to be considering cutting off the tentative trade links with China, which are presently permitted through a third country.
More world leaders have condemned the military crackdown on students in Beijing. The French President, Mr. Mitterrand, described the Chinese government as one which had been reduced to firing on young people. He said that such a government has no future. The Australian Prime Minister, Mr. Hawke, has cancelled a proposed visit to China as Australia deplored what it called the brutally excessive use of force against student demonstrators. Canada has urged China to end what it called the senseless killing of its own citizens and described the army's action as inexcusable. The exiled Tibetan religious leader, the Dalai Lama, said he was disappointed with the Chinese authorities and expressed sadness at the bloodshed in Beijing. In Washington, State Department officials are considering curbs on military sales to China to protest against the crackdown. And Chinese residents and students in the United States have staged demonstrations in cities across the country.
The demonstrators started gathering shortly before noon outside the Chinese consulate. The first few hundred quickly swelled to 2,000 students, shaking their fists at the officials peering at them from inside, waving banners and yelling slogans denouncing the Chinese government. The protesters are mostly Chinese students studying at universities around the Northeast, and they have come from miles around to vent their anger at the bloodshed back home.
We are trying to show the people, the government, that the Chinese students, all the Chinese students, are extending unanimous support of the Chinese people. We are expressing our deep grief for the dead, for the martyrs.
While some are angry, others are tearful, unable to believe their government would unleash the army against its own unarmed people.
I can't believe it. Coming to be so ugly like that.
A few hours later, the growing group of demonstrators marched along the streets of New York to the United Nations. By this time, their numbers had swelled to about 6,000. They came to deliver a letter to the Secretary General, asking him to convene an emergency session of the Security Council in order to condemn Beijing for crushing the democratic movement.
Americans, join us! George Bush, speak up!
Another gathering at Columbia University brought hundreds more students out for a vigil. Sitting quietly, they held a few moments' silence in memory of their fallen comrades. Calling Tiananmen Square a holy land running with blood, these students issued a warning.
The use of power only demonstrates the weakness of the dictators. We want to tell you, dictators, we will fight until your demise.
There have also been protests in other cities around the world. In Paris, hundreds of Chinese students and their supporters marched to the Chinese embassy. Many wore black armbands or squares of black cloth as a sign of mourning. The students paid tribute to those who died in Beijing, calling the victims martyrs of democracy. Similar sentiments were expressed in London, where nearly 3,000 marched to the Chinese embassy. The mile-long march took place in almost total silence, with the protesters carrying banners urging an end to the killings.
And now the day's other main stories. 8 people have been killed in Tehran as hundreds of thousands of mourners tried to get a last glimpse of the body of Ayatollah Khomeini. About 500 people were injured in the crush as the Ayatollah's body was taken to a large prayer ground in northern Tehran.
Mourners filled the streets of Tehran, weeping and beating their heads and chests. In TV footage broadcast twice, Iranians got their first glimpse of the body. As all this was going on, a council of Iranians moved with surprising speed to name a successor to the Ayatollah, President Ali Khamenei. Khamenei is considered among the more pragmatic of Iran's revolutionary leaders and has worked closely with parliamentary speaker Hashemi Rafsanjani. In the United States, the White House issued a statement on the Ayatollah's death, saying, "We hope Iran will now move toward assuming a responsible role in the international community." In Washington, a leader of the Iranian resistance, the Mujahideen, congratulated the Iranian people on the Ayatollah's death and claimed his group is amassing an army to try to topple the regime.
Khomeini's dictatorship, religious dictatorship, is not able to survive the death of the dictator.
The son of the late Shah of Iran also predicted upheaval in his homeland.
There's a definite political vacuum that is going to be created in Iran. That will leave ample opportunities for the opposition forces to step in and challenge the authority of the regime.
But one congressman says there isn't much the U.S. can do except hope a more liberal regime emerges that is willing to help release the American hostages.
We've been bitterly disappointed time and time again. So I hope for the best.